Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Spiritual Research Center here in Hamilton, Ontario. My name is Zachary Strong, and I am a scholar, author, and musician, and I'm also a Noahide, which means I am a non-Jew who follows the law of Moses. So today we're going to be talking about Christ consciousness and John 14:11. For my followers who have been with me up until this point, there might be some questions in your mind as to why a Noahide like myself is commenting on the Gospels. But the reality is that Jesus was a Jew, okay? He was arguably a zealous Jew. And some of the things that he's documented as saying actually have very deep roots in the Torah. And so I thought I would take John chapter 14 verse 11 and examine some of the Torah roots, even Kabbalistic roots, of what Jesus was saying when he said that I am in the Father and the Father is in me. So in this video, we're going to be looking at the Christian perspective on John 14:11. We're going to be examining the concept of Christ consciousness, which I think is quite interesting. And then we're going to get into the Kabbalistic perspective on what Jesus was saying in John 14:11. And finally, I'm going to share with you a meditation to build divine consciousness, which I've found helpful. The Jewish women that I've shared this with have found it helpful, and I think you'll find it helpful as well. Okay, so Jesus is recorded as saying, "I am in the Father, and the Father is in me," and the larger context of what he was saying in the gospel is, very truly I tell you, whoever believes in me will do the works I have been doing, and they will do even greater things than these. Okay? So Christians, they look at this verse and the teachings around this verse in the Christian world are, Jesus is declaring his divinity here. Particularly in the Gospel of John, this is a lot of, there's a lot of Jesus declaring his divinity in that gospel. They believe, based on this verse and other verses, that Jesus is uniquely divine and specifically the Son of God. And I think an assumption that many Christians would have here is that the Pharisees and the law of Moses types like myself, that we would heavily disagree with what Jesus is saying, when he says, I am in the Father and the Father is in me, right? I think the assumption is that, people like myself would be heavily disagreeing. However, as I'm about to share with you, the disagreement is somewhat imaginary once you get into, the Kabbalah of things. So, somewhat related to this verse is kind of a new agey concept called Christ consciousness. You might have heard the term before. If you haven't, you can Google it, but there's this concept of Christ consciousness, which is kind of adopting this divine outlook on everything and seeing oneself as part of the divine and so on. And that's essentially what Jesus was documented as saying in John 14:11. I am in the Father and the Father is in me. That's kind of an expression of, Christ consciousness, I suppose. So someone named Naya Swami Ananta said that Christ consciousness is the consciousness which does pervade the universe but is exemplified by the life of all liberated beings, in that they express not ego consciousness, not a separate, diluted, or divided consciousness, but the unitive consciousness of the Divine Father. Okay? Sounds a little bit new agey, sounds a little bit kind of like, everything is one, we're all God, and so on. Like, if someone is unhealthy, they could probably take this in a weird direction, but the concept of, kind of unity with God and a unitive consciousness and, breaking down of the ego, right? I think, there's a lot to be gained here, and to be honest, when you dive into the Torah world, those are some of the things that you pick up if you're reading the right material. Okay, so just to give a quick recap, okay? In the Gospel of John, Jesus is recorded as saying, I am in the Father and the Father is in me. Okay? Christians believe this to be an expression of Jesus's unique divinity, and that he's making a unique claim about himself in terms of who he is and so on. Okay? As a Noahide, I obviously have some different views about, who Jesus was and how he fits into the plan. But when we look at, this concept of Christ consciousness and unitive divine consciousness and so on, we can start to appreciate that there might be some layers here as to what Jesus is saying. And there might even be some Torah grounding in what he was saying because he was a Jew and arguably a zealous and knowledgeable Jew. Okay? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to look at the Kabbalistic view on John 14:11 and walk you through some very interesting concepts in Torah and Kabbalah. So the first concept we're going to be looking at is a Kabbalistic concept known as the Or Ein Sof, which means light without end. The second thing that we're going to be looking at is a verse in Deuteronomy, which includes the phrase Ein od milvado, or there is nothing besides him, like nothing besides God. And the third part that we're going to be looking at are some unavoidable conclusions that we can draw from these two concepts. And, these things will give us a deeper understanding of what Jesus was probably saying when he was recorded as saying, I am in the Father and the Father is in me. Okay, so let's take a look at the Ein Sof. So there's a lot that could be said here, but the easiest way of understanding the Ein Sof is that the infinite light, the light without end, is kind of the ground of all existence. It is God in his most infinite form. Okay? And, Or Ein Sof, or, light without end, that gives you probably a picture in your mind of what that might be. Okay? So it's basically super infinity. It's super infinity. However, as you may know, our world is somewhat finite, and so in order to create our world, God basically contracted part of himself. This is known as Tzimtzum. So God basically contracted the infinite light and kind of created various levels to existence, of which ours is the lowest and most constricted. Okay? In our world, God's infinite light is not immediately apparent to us. Okay? And that's because it's almost like a series of lampshades. It's almost like a series of kaleidoscopic lampshades that God has created in order to filter down the infinite light into our world. So now we're going to jump to a verse in Deuteronomy, chapter 4, verse 35, which contains the phrase, Ein od milvado. There is nothing besides him. There is nothing besides God. Okay? So the common understanding of this is that God is the only true God. If you just read this at a surface level in your Bible, you'll say, okay, God is the true God and there's no other God besides him. Okay? However, a kind of a deeper Kabbalistic understanding of this is that there is nothing but God. There's nothing but God. Okay? Everything is just God. So like these scissors, for example, are made of God stuff. Okay? It's heavily filtered down God stuff, like it's just an inanimate thing, but it's still made of God stuff. Okay? And in the same way that the scissors are made of God's stuff, you and I and everyone in the world, we are all made of God's stuff. And human beings in particular, we are basically little sparks of God. Okay? We're all little sparks of God, and we're going about our day and making free will decisions and so on. And, part of life's journey, especially for Bible people, is to become more godly. Okay, so we're born into the world. It's a confusing world. We don't know what's going on. We find our way to the Torah, okay, and then we start refining our character traits, becoming more compassionate, becoming more mature, right, and becoming more godlike. Okay? And again, there is nothing but God. Okay? The Or Ein Sof has contracted itself down to allow for our world to exist. We are existing in this world, discovering God, discovering what it means to be like God, making ourselves more like God. Okay? And so when we take a look at what Jesus was saying in John 14:11, okay, we find that there's actually some deep Torah roots and even Kabbalah roots in what he's saying. Because really what Jesus is saying here, I would argue, is not necessarily an expression of his unique and special divinity. Okay? The Christian reading of it is that, Jesus is saying that he's, the anointed Son of God and so on, and he's, special in that way. But really what Jesus is saying here is, you are in the Father, and the Father is in you. Okay? Jesus was a human being, just like all of us, right? He was a spark of God. Okay? You're a spark of God. We're all just sparks of God. Okay? And then when you look at what he was saying in greater context, whoever believes in me will do the works I've been doing, and they will do even greater things than these. Okay? What Jesus is saying, in a way, is you are also a spark of God. You can also, be like me, right? This idea of Jesus being a uniquely divine individual, right? I understand why Christians believe that, but the Torah view and the Kabbalistic view is we are all sparks of God. We are in the Father, and the Father is in us. Okay, and that is true for every human being. So I don't know if you found that illuminating or helpful. I think it's rather interesting. Especially for Christians who are watching, I think, the knowledge that you are not separate from God, the world is not separate from God, these scissors are not separate from God. Okay, we are all made of God stuff. We are all sparks of God. And part of our path in this world is to discover and cultivate the inner sense of divinity within ourselves. Okay? So the final thing I wanted to share is a bit of a meditation that can help you kind of access this and hopefully feel it for yourself. This is something I developed over the last couple of years. I field tested it with a group of Jewish women and, got good reviews. So hopefully this will help you as well. So what I want you to do is think of the Or Ein Sof. Okay, think of light without end, infinity. Okay, like first just focus on the feeling of infinity in your mind. Okay, focus on the feeling of infinity in your mind. Okay, now I want you to get the feeling of a fountain. Okay, this welling up. Okay, this overflowing. Okay, infinity and fountain. Okay, let the feeling of infinity and the feeling of welling up and overflowing, okay, let those two things exist in your mind at once. Okay, infinity and it's welling up and it's overflowing. Okay, now bring those feelings from your mind into your heart and into your body. Okay, because you are in the Father and the Father is in you. Okay, that infinity, that overflowing, okay, that welling up, that is your nature and your heritage as a human being. Okay? And so that meditation, that's something that you can do at home. That's something you can do when you're walking on the street. That's something you can do in nature, okay? Just allowing yourself to feel, infinity overflowing. And I am a spark of that infinity. And that overflowing and upwelling can exist within me if I allow it to. Okay? So I don't know if that was helpful. I don't know if that was interesting. I imagine, some of my Noahide followers might be shocked that I'm commenting on the Gospels, but the reality is that, what Jesus was saying here, I am in the Father and the Father is in me. Like many things that Jesus said, there are deep roots in the Torah for it. Okay? And as it turns out, this kind of thing also has roots in Kabbalah, because Ein Od Milvado, there's nothing but God. There's nothing but God. This idea that we are somehow separate from God is an illusion. It's an illusion. Okay? And in the days of the Geulah, or the redemption, the whole world will come to realize that Ein Od Milvado, there is nothing but God. We are all little sparks of God finding our way in a very confusing world. Okay? And in the days of the redemption, the knowledge that we are not separate from God will be universal. We will all see ourselves as being part of the Father, being in the Father, and the Father being in us. Okay? So, if you've watched this far, thank you. I hope this was helpful. And I offer you many, many blessings in the days ahead. And I hope, the meditation that I shared, I hope you're able to put that into practice as you're standing, as you're walking along the road, as you're at home, as you're in nature. And I hope you can really start to feel that God exists in you. God is attempting to work through you if you would only let him. Thank you, and God bless.